Hello, everyone. I'm Benita. Today with us, we have Dr. Kartik Shanker. Dr. Kartik Shanker is faculty of Center for Ecological Science, Indian Institute of Sciences, Bangalore. He works on community ecology and biogeography of various marine and terrestrial taxa. His work comprises diversity at various levels of organization, from genes to ecosystem, and at various scales from local communities to macro-ecological scale. He also works on ecology and evolution of communities, particularly on mixed species of foraging groups.
His efforts in the conservation of sea turtles, including olive ridley turtles in Orissa, leatherback turtles in Andaman and Nicobar Islands, and green turtles in the Lakshadweep Islands, are commendable. He's the founder editor of the Indian Ocean Turtle newsletter and Current Conservation, and editor of Conservation and Society. He is a founding trustee of Dakshin Foundation, which aims to inform and advocate conservation and natural resource management through interdisciplinary research and action. Thank you, Kartik, for joining us today.
It's my pleasure, Benita and Shuman. Thanks for inviting me. Would you just like me to start with a broad overview of the things that we do?
Yeah.
When I was in college, at the other end of town, Shuman, the historical rival of Loyola College, as we discussed a few minutes ago, Madras Christian College. I was uncertain of what I wanted to do with my life. I was one of those people that had tried for medicine and failed. I was very happy to have failed because by then I was really enjoying my time in MCC, sports and cultural events and all that. But I didn't have a clue as to what to do for my higher studies or career. And one day a senior came up to me and said, "Do you want to go for a turtle walk?" And I was wondering if this is some kind of strange dance or some kind of sporting exercise. They're like, "What do you mean turtle walk? What is that?" Right? And I had grown up actually in a part of Madras, now Chennai, near the beach, near Besanagar Beach, where apparently, unknown to me, my grandfather actually saw a sea turtle come up and nest when he was there on his evening walk. And I did not even know that this had happened and that these turtles nest on this beach so close to my house. So these guys were like, "Did you not know that olive ridleys nest on our coast? That that people have been conducting turtle walks for the last 15 years. These were started by Romulus Whittaker in the early 70s, and it was quite an iconic thing. I mean, everybody who was sort of inclined towards natural history knew about ridleys and turtle walks and so on. And I, of course, I hadn't been in Chennai before that for some years. So I didn't know about any of this. So I happily went off on a turtle walk at night. And in the 80s, the hatcheries were maintained by the forest department. And prior to that, as I said, when Rom Whittaker and others had started the turtle walks, for many, many years, it was maintained by NGOs. And then from the early 80s, the forest department maintained the hatcheries, and the NGOs conducted turtle walks and collected the eggs and gave them to the guards and watchers at the hatchery to sort of relocate them there. So these NGOs that were conducting these turtle walks, I joined one of them, and we probably the end of the season went for several turtle walks, didn't see a single thing, maybe saw a track, I don't remember. Anyway, at the end of that, I was like, "Oh, interesting," right? Early the next year, it was my third year in college, the senior Tito Chandy comes up to me and says, "The forest department has decided to close down all its hatcheries for reason unknown. They must have run out of funds, but one of them said, we have released so many hatchlings that the Bay of Bengal is full of turtle hatchlings. It has reached its carrying capacity. We don't want to release any more hatchlings," or something. I mean, it's something that sounds quite humorous. But for whatever reason, they had decided not to continue the hatcheries. And Tito and a couple of his turtle walking buddies had come up with this, what in retrospect has to be the stupidest, most ambitious, craziest plan, which was like, let's start a students group and build a hatchery ourselves. And you have to get permission from the state government, from the central government. You have to get money, all of this, and we were all young and foolish then. So I was like, "Oh, what a great idea! I'll join you guys." And thus was born the Students Sea Turtle Conservation Network. where I think there were 5 of us. One was president, one was secretary, one was treasurer, that sort of situation. All of us like aged between 20 and 22. And so we ran off and borrowed money actually from families and set up a thatched hut and a hatchery and so on. And we had initially we had permission from the state forest department, but eventually like we managed to get permits from the central government for a few years as well. But it was quite, I mean, I think, like I said, it was, in retrospect, it was just a bunch of college kids going out and deciding to set up a hatchery for the Schedule 1 species. And for the first 10 odd years of this organization, every 2 or 3 years, those of us who were doing whatever our degrees would finish and leave. And some other person would be like, oh, am I the most senior person? Oh, I guess I have to run this organization. And it ran like that for 10, 12 years. It really, I mean, every year I would keep in touch with these people and I would say, oh, who's running it this year? And they'd be like, oh, that person. I was like, wow, when that person joined, he didn't even seem interested, like, or mature enough to run and, run this show. But it really kind of went from hand to hand in this very informal fashion. Till about in the late 90s, early 2000s, a school teacher from a nearby school got involved, and then it's kind of had a little bit more mentorship. But that organization is 30 years old, and that's how I got, cycling back to the first years when I was there. We, went out on the beach every night, slept through classes in college, and basically that was our life. I mean, we lived and breathed turtles for those 6 months of the year. And in that process, I kind of like really sort of discovered, I would say, discovered ecology and conservation. And at that time, I mean, I kind of made that decision that, this is what I want to do with my life. And of course, therefore, I was thinking of doing a PhD on sea turtles, and ended up, applying to professors abroad, and that didn't, hadn't worked out so I took a year off after this. I went and taught in a school called Rishi Valley, my alma mater. And while I was doing that, I was applying, and I had some positive sort of feedback from people doing sea turtle research in the US, but I also got admission in IISC. And the flip was, to take IISC now, but nothing to do with sea turtles, and wait longer and go to the US and work with people who I've gotten to know later and really are iconic in the field. I mean, it would have been a very different sort of trajectory, but some very, very accomplished and very, very nice people. Nevertheless, I chose the bird in the hand and joined IISc, and ended up working on diversity in the high elevation forest grasslands of the Western Ghats and the Nilgiris, so the Shola grassland landscapes. I was looking at community ecology and island biogeography and questions like that. And I kind of like segued. It started out because I was interested in turtles. As I said, I'll work on snakes and lizards and frogs and so on. And that became not feasible because of taxonomic issues. And so I ended up working on small mammals. Not many people know this. I actually worked on rodents and insectivores for my PhD. Oh, wow. Now, all the stories, it sort of wraps around because after I finished my PhD, I felt this unfulfilled desire to work on sea turtles. So I actually got in touch with BC Chowdhury at the Wildlife Institute of India, and he supported my proposal to work on sea turtle genetics. And I had some really excellent international mentors as well. Brian Bowen, who's kind of the father of sea turtle, phylogeography and genetics around the world. He's one of the pioneers of that field. So he was a very sort of kind, distant advisor. I still work with him. And so with his help and so on, we put together this proposal, and I started working on sea turtle genetics, and that sort of took me to Orissa and Lakshadweep and Andamans, and places where I still have long-term, where I subsequently started the long-term monitoring programs. So that was all seeded by the work for my postdoc on sea turtles. Because I started working on genetics when I sort of like again passed through Atri, another NGO in Bangalore, for a couple of years, and as a scientist before I joined IISc as faculty. But because of my background in genetics, when I came back to IISC, the genetics and the mountains and the frogs and everything sort of like also came back together again and formed this new sort of like new interest in evolutionary ecology and biogeography, which I'd always been interested in, but it had not sort of been a primary goal of my research. So when you add all that up, I ended up doing the thing that I started out in college, and then became sort of a core field during my postdoc. And so I had this program on sea turtles, which I still do. Academically with most of my students and with the research, we kind of like went into that evolutionary ecology and biogeography direction. We're looking at the history of, we've done a lot of work on frogs, lizards, and snakes of the Western Ghats, but also peninsular India to broadly across peninsular India. Some of my students have also looked at population genetics of coastal invertebrates like mollusks. And then I have this problem that, when I see interesting ideas, I don't seem to be able to say no. So along the way, I've become very interested in macroecology because, of the work that, that my partner Meera Oman had done in the Himalayas on plants. And so that, sort of the large scale diversity patterns became a part of our research program. One of my first students, Hari Sridhar, turned up and wanted to work on mixed species foraging in birds. And so now we work on mixed species foraging in birds and fish. And, so that became a research program. And so in about, to end that very long story, about 10 years ago, I learned to dive. And since then, I've been looking for excuses to dive with my students. So we do in-water research on reefs and reef fish now. So yeah, I've started to say that when I start something new, I've got to give up something that I'm doing. So I'm trying to pass my sea turtle work on to younger people, because you can't just go on adding stuff, right? You've got to let some things go as well. So that's the story of my research, which is so we ended up doing a fair diversity of things in the lab, and it's all because the Rolling Stone gathered a lot of moss. Actually, it just couldn't get every time it passed through one patch, it picked up a different kind of moss.
Is there any particular incident when you realized that, oh, I have fallen in love with science?
Actually, I haven't answered that question, to be honest. I did tell you how I fell in love with ecology and conservation, which is went out and the second season when we started SSTCN, I remember Tito and I were out on the beach, and for some reason we had shaved our heads. I don't know, so it's a college thing, and it was really cold.
I know.
So on, right?
We used to do the same.
Yeah, so, it looks like it was a bit of a tradition. But anyway, I remember this because we're freezing, right? Even though it's Chennai, I mean, like on the beach at night, it can get pretty cold, and then we saw this track, and we see relatively few turtles, and you see an up track and a down track, she's gone, and missed her again type of thing, right? And you're familiar with that. When you go to Orissa and you see 100,000 turtles during an Aribada, you get over it. You're like, after that, you're like, turtle, what, so what, right? But in the Chennai days, seeing one turtle was just this huge excitement, and I had never seen one. And so we saw the up track, and then there was no down track, and we both realized that she was on the beach, and sort of then crawling up and seeing your first turtle and seeing her actually laying these eggs. I mean, it's the most sort of phenomenal, feeling, because you're right next to this wild animal which comes ashore just to nest and is in the ocean most of the time. So that you really feel inspired in a way, and that was sort of like, for me, I was like, oh, this is cool, right? But it still wasn't quite science. I mean, to be honest, I thought it was, but when I joined the Center for Ecological Sciences. And my own supervisor was Professor Sukumar, who's best known for his work on elephants. But we had other faculty such as Professor Joshi, who kind of mentored us through most of our quantitative research. Professor Garaka, who is a extremely well-known behavioral ecologist, and sort of one of the premier behavioral ecologists of the generation who pioneered the field in India. We had these people mentoring and teaching us and so on. And through them, and sort of through being at the institute surrounded by, I think, I would say most of the people who liked ecology were either ecologists or physicists, not so much other biologists very much. But I think it was, both through our own peers and through our mentors. I think it was, where I really got inspired by the science. Professor Gargill had founded the department. He was not very active, but the work that he had done in population ecology in the 70s is really considered to be quite classic, even at a global level. His wife, Professor Sulochana Gargill, who had started the Center for Atmospheric Sciences, and she taught us a course as well. So just interacting with these people actually changed my perspective about what I wanted to do. Till that point, I was like, yeah, we need to study ecology and do some science for conservation. But then subsequently for me, conservation became not a secondary goal, but it became an independent goal. It's like, okay, yeah, that's one goal in life. Science is another goal in life. I mean, it was like both were in a way equally weighted, I'd say. And I think sometimes for me, it feels like conservation can be frustrating. Science is rewarding.
Apart from being a scientist, you have different roles, like even in your in your family. So how do you manage all of these different roles?
I think most of us in academia find ways to just balance, and we'd like to call it positive negligence. That I do think a certain amount of negligence is better than helicopter parenting, and I say this out loud. we were all neglected to some degree, and we're all fine. So I hope my son's turned out okay. We think he has, but I don't think we. My wife Meera works as well. And she's currently holds a position at Dakshin, and we've got very full professional lives. But I think the balance for me, we've been fortunate in the sense that we've managed to sort of complement each other, and I think our son Vishak was not hard work, so that worked out well. The lovely thing about living in India is that you can have household help who become part of the family. So with all of that, I think we've managed very well. For me, the balance really is that I've got a day job, which is IISS, which is who they pay my salary, and I, had better, fulfill my obligations there. But at the same time, I have almost an equivalent set of responsibilities at Dakshin, where I manage the flagships program. Most of my turtle work gets done through Dakshin. So our long-term monitoring projects in Orissa and Andamans and Lakshadweep, and then we've started some work on sharks and rays now. Right now, currently based out of Malvan. We've done sea snake work in the past, and more recently we started work on community well-being. So we've got programs on health and sports. So managing that basket of things, and I still oversee the work at current conservation. So which is so between, I think, balancing all of that while finding time to have some time for sports and music and so on for oneself. Is the balance. I still try to run and play basketball, and last year I started learning to play the drums, and so for me the balance is really about how do I find time for those fun things in the middle of all of these multiple things that I seem to have, as I said, gather over time.
So I believe that there were a lot of phases in your life that were challenging. So what was the most challenging phase of your life according to you?
That's a pretty good question, actually. I mean, and I tell my students this frequently, that they see us in these positions where we've got jobs, in fact, and especially in sort of whatever mid to late career faculty, right? You've got jobs, you've got promotions, you seem very settled, and everybody thinks that your life worked out exactly like you planned. And I tell them, that when I was a student, I applied to 20, universities and didn't get any responses. I wrote to 25 professors and didn't get responses. I wrote a dozen postdoc applications and didn't and got rejected. I've been rejected from every major, ecology conservation grant, granting scheme. I've never had a Whitley or a National Geographic or British Ecological Society or a conservation leadership. All of those things that young people like all apply to today. I never got one of those. I mean, and I applied to them. I mean, it's not that I didn't apply. I mean, and so I tell them that I've been rejected so many times in my life. And I'm not comparing myself to him with a capital H, which is because I play basketball. That's Michael Jordan. There was a great Michael Jordan ad in the 90s where he said, I've missed so many shots, game-winning shots. I've lost so many close games. I've blah blah blah, and all my failures. And he says, and at the end he says, I succeed because I failed, right? And it was a beautiful ad. And I just thought that, I slipped in the little comparison to Jordan, as you can see, but but I think it's important for young people to sort of to realize that those of us who've succeeded, it was a combination of perseverance and a little bit of luck, right? And so there were many challenging phases. I mean, I think early in college that I alluded to not knowing what I wanted to do next. And some of my closer, older friends remember a little bit that they were like, wow, you were very confused then because you didn't even know what you wanted to do next. I was like, psychology, this, that. I had no clue. Getting into a PhD program is challenging. Getting a job is very challenging, right? So each of these is like at every stage you sort of question what's coming next, it's a bit scary, and it's a bit it's certainly slightly anxiety inducing, and sometimes later, I think for a little later in life, sometimes you get overwhelmed with the commitments that you've taken on. So all of these, I don't think there's a single incident that I'd pick out as such, but there's many times in this sort of like profession where you do feel, yeah, it's a challenge. And honestly, even after you have a job and everything, and it's fine. I mean, I have a job and I'm like very happy I do. But I tell people you really have to get used to rejection. We send out my students' papers now, and they'll get rejected from 6 journals without even going for review, right? And it's still frustrating to me, except that I now have to tell the student like just relax, don't worry about it, just chill. You got to get used to this. Right. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's a field where I said conservation is frustrating compared to academia, right? But academia it's not a, I mean, it's not, yeah, not a walk in the park as the mental health issues around the world in academic institutions are demonstrating. That it's a, yeah, it's a whole set of challenges.
I cannot stop myself from asking this. Like, how do you deal with your failures?
I'll talk about the more constructive ways of coping with it. I think when we were younger, I think we should just go and sleep. And I mentioned this a lot because I mentioned this because today you're inundated with messaging on social media, which is this constant reminder of your failure relative to somebody else, right? Your inability to post something about your success or how bad you're feeling about your failure really gets amplified by seeing what's happening out there. And so you feel even though you're not on a stage with the spotlight on you, you still feel that way. I think when you have a failure of some sort. Back in the day, we all failed at one thing or another. We just like took our time, spent the time with with your friends or family, who we felt comfortable with, and just like allowed your system to acknowledge it, and
Restart.
then reboot and restart, right? And when I said sleep, in a sense, I just remember like, and I'm sure this doesn't necessarily like have to apply to everybody, but I remember when I was like feel really annoyed about some analysis or something, I just go to my hostel room and like, you know, sleep for 14 hours or whatever it is, read a book, sleep, then, you know, just be by myself for a while, and then like next day you're really rejuvenated in a sense, you know, or in a day or two. But and sort of like the opposite of that, in a sense, I think that what's really important is for people to be able to talk about their failures, actually, to be honest, right? And I think that for me, over the years, I've had, you know, really good friends and, you know, a life partner with whom, you know, you can sort of like really express your frustrations. And I mean, it's not that when I fail, when the way I put it, no, I failed and I succeeded, is almost as every time you fail, you're like, oh, it's no problem. When you fail, you feel horrible. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. I mean, and it happens to, you know, and to be able to express that, to express the anger, because, you know, you feel like you didn't deserve it, or somebody treated you badly or whatever it is. And, you know, like a good application got rejected for no reason, a good paper got rejected for no reason. So you can express all of that and share it. And, you know, and then sort of like, you know, for me, it's always been to be able to talk your way through and out of it. So I don't want to make it seem like getting over failure is easy. It's something that that people have to find their mechanisms for, because it's a part of this part of this profession.
You mentioned an important aspect of how talking to people can, like, especially to people who are like anchors in your life, and in today's world of social media, although we are like apparently connected to a lot of people, it's almost you're not, and
but we are not.
And I'll also very bluntly say that, I mean, that in today's climate, I think sometimes the best person to talk to is a therapist, because sometimes your family, your friends, and so on don't get what you're going through. And in the good old days, when those options weren't available, of course, we didn't really have a choice. And, you know, having a therapist in those days was like very, but now I think the stigma is reduced to some degree. But I'll also openly say that, like, sometimes the person, a therapist is a person without an agenda in your life, right? They're paid to help, right? Their job is to help you. So sometimes it's the easiest thing to sort of like get over that thing and be like, you know what? I'm finding it hard to be functional, because, you know, some of the things that I've gone through are confusing me or causing anxiety in a way that is preventing me from being productive and functional, right? In those instances, I really think, you know, that when I say talk to somebody, including, you know, whether it's family or friends, or sometimes the right person is even, you know, not even, is actually first choice, even perhaps can be a therapist in many instances.
So I was recently hearing like an interview of Dr. Wendy Bickmore in University of Edinburgh. And she actually talked about it, that, you know, we only talk about students getting mental therapy, and we don't talk about mentors getting a therapy to address students well. And
I've been bringing this up in IISC constantly, and they've held one or two, like, you know, they've held a couple of large sessions. I mean, like, lots of faculty sitting in. I don't know if that's going to be effective, but it's a major issue that I think is not being addressed at all. I mean, to any.
So I have always heard about Dakshin Foundation and like read about it and all of that, especially from Hari and like the sources on internet. So I would like to hear from you how it was, how was your experience working with Dakshin Foundation?
Well, I'd have to rephrase that question a little bit, because, you know, my partner Meera and me and a couple of others, Arfi Sridhar and Naveen Nambudri, who were colleagues of mine at Atri, 4 of us started Dakshin in 2008. And we were part of the coastal Aarti, Naveen and I were part of the coastal marine program at A3, and we'd worked on a project on post-tsunami assessments on the the Tamil Nadu coast mainly. And when that project ended, we decided that collectively everybody felt that the kind of work that we were doing in coastal marine areas would be better served by by its being housed in in an NGO dedicated to that rather than as part of a larger organization. And so we broke away from A3 and formed Dakshin then. Meera was then working as a managing editor at Conservation Society, and she also sort of chose to join Dakshin. And our goals from the beginning were really to sort of like work on coastal environmental issues using both the ecological and the human lens sort of like equally, and sort of balance our work on ecosystems and humans. And towards that, we our initial programs looked at coastal resource governance, which is what focused on policy and law at national scales, and leadership and governance at local scales. And my colleague Aarti Sridhar led that part. And Naveen and I kind of led the programs that focused more on an ecological lens. I led the work on flagship species like sea turtles and sea snakes and sharks and so on, which some of which is more recent. And Naveen led the work on fisheries. So we were trying to sort of like balance this, looking at it from both the ecological perspective and the social perspective. And over the years, we've worked, in predominantly in Orissa and Andamans, Lakshadweep and Tamil Nadu. But now, more recently, what we've started doing is those were the initial programs at Dakshin looked at all of these elements from these different angles, but was still to some degree, siloed from each other, right? Like there was the work that we did with fisheries and community-based monitoring and so on happened, along one trajectory, and the governance happened along another, and so on. And so, more recently, we've been trying to bring these together in an initiative that we call Sea Change, where we're trying to create these integrated models of ecosystem and human well-being in the sites where we work. So sites of long-term engagement. Our primary sort of like field sites right now for this integrated engagement are in Orissa and Andamans, but we're in the process of expanding that to other locations as well. And what we're trying to do there is really sort of hit all the buttons or pull on all the threads that are required for sort of like an actual shift in community or human well-being. Is what often happens is like somebody goes and does an education program, or somebody else does a health program, somebody does something with livelihoods, but there's always some other. I mean, as they say, the weakest link in the chain is the one that sort of defines the strength of the chain. So all of the things that we do may not actually lead to progress for those communities because there's something else that's pulling them down. So we're basically trying to like now create that model where we're able to sort of like facilitate, I would say, not rather than sort of like provide service, but facilitate their progress along multiple axes, including sort of these standard social economic indicators, as well as development indicators and cultural linkages to the environment, because at the end of the day, we want this also to link to ecosystem health, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So that's kind of been Dakshin's trajectory, and my role within it. And well, the last part of that story is that it's also something that we're trying to create a model that's actually like replicable or scalable, so that you do get these model villages where an organization has gone and worked across multiple sectors, but then that often happens in one or a few villages and not really across a landscape. So we're also seeing, and we put an integrated model in place that then actually like can be taken up.
So coming to our next question, what is your opinion on science communication in India? Because science communication doesn't only include people in science talking to people in science, it includes people in science talking to the local people about the conservation, and local people play a very major role in conservation, like when it comes to conservation biology. So what do you think about science communication in India?
I think science communication has, it's been there. It's been mostly, scientists talking to an interested audience. So in fact, there are, there are magazines like Science Reporter that were produced by one of the science academies, I think. And it's been around for a very long time. The Indian Academy of Science started Resonance in the 90s. Right now, these are good publications. There need to be more of them, of course. But on the main, I think the shortfall of some of them was that they were really addressing a very narrow,
a sciencey audience.
An already science inclined audience. Even a college student won't read Resonance unless you're a geeky college student, And so I think, so to that degree, I would certainly like to say that they have existed, but they sort of needed to sort of like grow by an order of magnitude, and also grow the diversity of audiences that one addresses. And so I think a lot of the NGOs in the environmental sector do have education programs, environmental education programs. There's lots of environmental education programs, and in a way, I think that for me it was turtles, but for many people in my generation, it was the nature camp that WWF ran in the 80s that sort of inspired them to get into ecology and wildlife biology, right? So those have also had a positive influence. I think the question though today that is, how do we make science more democratic, right?
Exactly.
And I think it's not. Right. I think the way that we've looked at science communication is this one-way street of we will communicate what we know to somebody else. Right?
Exactly. And,
to a certain degree, even with a magazine like Current Conservation, which is now running for 15 years, there's still an element in CC of from X to Y, right? And it's innovative in the sense that it brings science and art together, and we're very proud of what we produce and the reach we have and all of that. And we're trying more and more to reach a general audience with stories about conservation, and not just like again geeky college students and in community sort of like people. So we're trying to widen that reach, but my own criticism of it is that particular format is still kind of one-way traffic. Now, except in the art and science part, where I think there is learning in terms of learning how to communicate, right? Like there's learning for scientists about how do you tell a story visually. But setting that aside, I think that one of the things we've been talking about in Dakshin, and it's sort of reflected in our work that we've done with communities in the Lakshadweep, is when we set up these community monitoring programs, how do we set them up in a way that it actually acknowledges, internalizes, and emphasizes, their own knowledge systems, their own view of that, of that system, what they want to get out of it, and so on. And I've kind of like argued that there are that science is a bit like English. Right, like in this world, you can't get around like without English, right? You can be Spanish, you can be, Bengali, you can be anything. But at the end of the day, this English has taken over the world to a great extent, right? That's just like full stop on that, at this point of time. But in a way, while we can be, and I think that the way that people have argued that one can maintain and retain cultural and linguistic diversity is, to be multilingual, bilingual, multilingual, to keep English, because it offers you pathways to social progress, right? Like people in lower economic strata, you can't say like, "Nahi, theek hai, you Tamil is speak Tamil," because it actually hinders your social progress to not know English. So the pathway is obviously by bilingual, to be bilingual or multilingual or whatever it is. In the same way, I think that science has become indispensable to the way we communicate about to each other about the world, right? About the state of the world, or about observations about nature, whether it's physics or ecology or conservation. And so the work that we've tried to do is to sort of build on that platform while acknowledging these, these indigenous knowledge systems and their worldviews, right? So
Yeah.
I think that the answer lies in that two-way communication. So when
True.
you say science communication, like my fundamental argument would be that it has to go both ways.
Both
right?
ways.
Absolutely.
There may be, there may be elements that we cannot throw out of the window because, like, I think the phrase that we've used before is science is sort of the lingua franca of the establishment.
As a conservation biologist in India, what are the main challenges you see? Conservation biologists are the biggest challenge to conservation in India.
Wow.
Now I think people are beginning to slowly realize, but it's this archaic view of, which was again sort of, it was match made in heaven, actually, this Western centric view of pristine nature, which came from the notions of wilderness largely in the US in the early 1900s, from writers, thinkers like Thoreau and other pioneers of conservation like John Muir and Aldo Leopold. This idea of these pristine wildernesses, which subsequently got proved to not really be pristine, because the landscapes that they thought were beautiful and nature and so on actually looked the way they did because indigenous Native Americans had transformed those landscapes in previous centuries. So they were not, ironically, they were not even pristine. And when those people were removed, changes happened to those landscapes. But that notion kind of spread around the world in the form of conservation by the mid 20th century through all of these like large NGOs, conservation NGOs like WWF, and later the Nature Conservancy and Conservation International and so on. And the Nature Conservancy was set up to buy lands to set them aside for conservation. That's how they started. So this idea that conservation had to be done by removing people, by the time that came to India, it was like I said, it was a match made in heaven, because we had this history of rulers setting aside princely reserves and all of that. And our early conservationists were empowered by, again, by the governments at the time. Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, what she did for conservation was spectacular, but at the same time, she, along with these early conservationists, put in place this very exclusionary model of conservation in India. Parallel to this model of conservation was largely driven by conservation biologists, right? Like these hardcore people, sure, like in ecology, wildlife biology, and so on. And that, I think, over time, I think it was important to certainly set aside areas in a particular form, but the form in which we have done it and the form in which it's being propagated, the form that not just, of course, in India, but not other parts of the world as well, in the long term really has alienated people from conservation, right? And it also restricts conservation to this like 4% of the landscape or whatever it is, right? Mm-hmm. And you don't think about environmental sustainability or conservation across the rest of the landscape. You don't think of the human rights abuses that you have perpetrated by by removing people from their homes, from constraining their lives in other ways. So I think all of this, in a way, is a bit of a, there's perhaps it was well-intentioned, perhaps it was not even well-intentioned, some of it, but it is a bit of a dark stain, on us as a society.
Yeah.
Conservation, I think, has the distinction of, I think, resulting in the third most refugees or something worldwide after war and dams or something like that.
Right.
So and who's responsible for this? Conservation biologists.
You have traveled, like, because of your projects, I guess you have traveled a lot, and there have been like 1,000 stories of it. But like, what is the one most exciting story that you have in your mind?
Things that happen are exciting in the moment. Right? Like I was diving in the Andamans last week, and after a very long time, we were diving near one of the field sites near our field base, and there's some nice sites over there, but But on that dive, we saw a nurse shark twice on the same dive being followed by a great giant trevally. And on the second one time, it really sort of like literally bumped into my research colleague who was like right in front of me. And then for all the people who missed it on the first dive, there was another giant nurse shark sleeping under a rock on our second dive, right? So of course, at that moment you come out and you're like, oh my God, I was so excited. We saw 2 sharks on the dives today. But on the larger scheme of things, it's not, I'm not going to remember that story because that was only exciting for that day, right? On the other hand, there are other things that happen that, one time when my colleague Manish Chandy and I went to set up the camp in West Bay in Little Andamans, the boat nearly capsized while we were, going to the shore. And so we couldn't get back onto the boat at the same site. And so we ended up trekking for nearly 13, 14 hours across the beach and, across the coast and so on. It was just that's a very exciting story when I tell it in later, but it was not exciting at that moment at all. At that moment, we were like, oh my God, we whole day without food and water. And, we were like beginning to get cramps and desperately waiting to reach the boat to have, our field assistant, Agu, I think at about 9 o'clock at night, we saw this like light in the distance and we realized that he was walking back towards us with 1 flask of tea and some biscuits. And that was the most exciting moment of that trip. But yeah, I mean, more seriously, I think I talked about the first olive ridley I saw, the first leatherback. I remember that people say leatherback turtle, giant turtle, and all that. And so waiting for. I started reading about turtles in the late 80s when we started SSTCN. My first trip to the Andamans was before my trip to the Andamans, when I was in Orissa. I was waiting in Gahirmata for the Aribada, and then it didn't happen. So I went off to Rushikulya to collect blood samples there. And while I was in Rushikulya, we got news that the Aribada had started in Gahirmata, right? So got in a project jeep and drove for like 24 hours, like 12 hours, and then on the boat for like 8 hours, and like almost like a day and a half later, we kind of arrived on this beach, teeming with 5,000, 10,000 turtles. And you've been hearing about that whole life. You've been here, not whole, you've been reading about this and seeing pictures, and suddenly you come across a little hump on the beach and you see these 5,000 turtles on the beach. And then 2 years later, on the beach, and you're like, there's a leatherback on the beach, and like somebody says, come see, there's a leatherback. So each of these times, I mean, whether it was a frog that I'd never seen before, or a snake that you're seeing for the first time, I think each of those is like they're all magic moments. Note that I haven't mentioned any mammals.
What do you love to do most when you're taking a break from science?
Sports and music. Try and play basketball when my back is in good shape. Otherwise, I run, go to the gym, all of that, and play music with friends. So play a little bit of the guitar. I started learning the drums. So for me, free time is sports and music, and writing, actually, to a certain extent. So writing children's stories has always been like popular articles. Children's stories has been a source of I think for me, not so much work, but it's an outlet.
So like opening a lab anywhere is a big challenge. So talking about India, what were the challenges in opening a lab in India?
Being at an IISc actually is in many ways is more comfortable than other than being at the sort of like really the top institutions in those countries. And even those come with an enormous amount of pressure, right? It's not that we don't have any pressure at all, but like we are super privileged. So the challenges that I would say, if I were to compare our challenges in general, we don't face that many. We'll all complain. We'll be like, oh, the funds were less, or the administration is, the paperwork gets processed slowly, or you got to jump through all these bureaucratic hoops. Of course, we all complain, but if you look at it in the larger social sense, I think the challenges that we personally face are relatively few.
One of the questions that I wanted to ask you when you were explaining about about the entire scenario of science and the IISc. So, what would be your advice to someone like us who are in their early PhD life, or they're completing their PhD life and they want to establish a lab, maybe in India? So, what are the things that we should keep in mind?
Professionally, getting into one of the premier institutions is at a social level, I can make the case that a broader range of institutions needs to be populated and built up. But for an individual, you've got to obviously try, your access to resources and good students and colleagues and all of that is obviously much better at the premier institutions. And to get into those institutions, you just need high quality publications. Despite all of the talk about science communication and mentorship and teaching and all of that, at the end of the day, 90% of decision making happens on the basis of publications. I personally don't agree with that, but that's the system.
So, what are your views on impact of social media in today's science?
It's one of those things that's a necessary evil, no? Or not. I don't even know necessary evil. It's well. It's one of those things that isn't going away. You can't help it. It's like it's there to stay, and I have mixed feelings about it because it's, in the sense that anyone can say anything on social media, which is its greatest strength, but it's also its greatest weakness.
Right.
So I'm not going to. I think it's it's bad for mental health. But it exists, and we just have to deal with it the way we deal with traffic.
What do you think is the importance of self-discipline in research? What are the strategies to build a good self-discipline?
I think these are things that people have to discover for themselves. There is also no standard set of expectations, right?
True.
I might, in addition to my science, I might want to write one popular article a year. Somebody might want to write 5. Somebody might not care. I mean, it's like, what are the goals? Why are you setting these goals for yourself? One is, of course, the job may require it. But beyond that, academics tend to set a lot of goals for themselves that go well beyond their own. People talk a lot about how, you get a permanent job, and then, after that, many people with these, once you get tenure, people stop teaching, and, then they stop, the sort of the retired professor syndrome. And this is true. It is a problem. There are people who kind of just, after they get professorship or get tenure, then stop taking certain responsibilities. And it genuinely is a problem. But the flip side is actually the greater majority are people who are attempting to perform, in a way beyond their expectations, because it's like they have personal ambitions of, I want to be the best known, I want to be the best, whatever, neurobiologist or microbiologist or theoretical physicist or whatever it is. So very often academics are setting their own expectations in certain ways. And I think people need to ask the question of, there might be a practical point that, in order for me to get a job in a top university in India, I need to have 10 papers. So that's my goal, because it's like it's a stepping stone to the next thing, right? But often those goals don't even come from a practical need.
When you select a student for your lab, what do you see in them?
Potential.
Is there any set of questions that you usually ask, like all the students?
I think, one of the things that I learned from some of the, senior faculty in my own department, is, we test for aptitude, and we test for people's ability to think about science rather than what they know about science. And that's kind of a hallmark of, a CES interview, I think. Beyond that, I mean, for me personally, like for some of us who do a lot of field work, we also do need to select students that have the ability to go and work in the field. I take a lot of master's students, and some of them, like, at the end of the master's, may realize that they don't really want to do field work, and that's okay, right? And it's a short, it's a learning sort of phase. But for a PhD student who needs to spend, in my lab, usually you need to spend at least a couple of field seasons in the field. So we try and select people who have demonstrated that, you can say, I love being in the field, but if you haven't actually been there and been bitten or had to work off boats in choppy weather, you don't know if you've enjoyed it till you've been through the challenging parts of it, right? So then we try and select people that have some demonstrated ability to not just ability to be in the field, but have tried it and have realized they enjoy it.
So coming to our last question, what are your thoughts on the kitchen lab?
Well, I think a lot of what we've talked about today, in a sense, already captures the I think the essence of of the lab, which is that we talked about democratizing science, having science reach the ordinary person, the taxpayer, and democracy itself is also not, it's not just a matter of opening your door, right? I mean, like, in the sense that the ability of people to walk through that door is also varies. So in a sense, which is what the affirmative action in education and in the job market and all aims to do. It recognizes the fact that you can say that this is open to everybody, but not everybody has the same capacity. So in some senses, we have to go out of our way. In a way, I think the word democracy itself doesn't capture it. In a way, it's inclusivity, right? It's diversity and inclusion that we're aiming to accomplish with science. And on the one hand, I think this is very, very crucial for environmental issues, because as I said some time back, I think the engagement of a wider citizenry, of a wider constituency in addressing our environmental issues of the time is critical to their long-term solutions. We can't do it by these, whatever these band-aid, solutions and, by these exclusionary policies. It's not possible. And to engage them, we actually need to engage them in not just in the action, but in the process of thinking through it, right? So in that sense, this meeting of knowledge systems, of having a common science, so to speak, is very critical with communities in the field of environment, sustainability, and conservation. But I think at a much broader level in society as well. I think that I'm as a person who's read social science critiques of science and technology, I hesitate to say that science and technology provide the solutions. They often don't, right? It's like every scientific or technological solution that we've found to solve our water problems has been whatever devastatingly wrong in many instances, right? So in some senses, I think the notion that science or technology actually provides solutions is slightly misconstrued. However, I think the ability to more democratically decide what science and technology is used depends on the access of people to that science and technology, to understanding it, right?
Yeah.
It's easy to say, yeah, sure, I'll take a flight, right? Somebody invented a plane, that's great. But what about everything else? What are the things that we're saying yes to, right? Depends a little bit on the public understanding of those actions that are often based on science and technology, right? And so that larger, broader understanding of science and technology, I think, is crucial for social growth. And like the stalwarts I mentioned before, I'm also a strong critic of blind faith and its consequences. And I think that science does have that role in society of freeing us from some of those notions.
Absolutely.
Sure. Thank you so much for answering all the questions.
Thank you so much. It was really lovely talking to you, and like I have heard so much about you, and it was a pleasure talking to you.